Hi scholars, happy Friday! Today we're going to be reading Unit 8, Chapter 7 in our Native American unit. It looks a little like this. Before we get started, I want to do a little bit of a check-in. If you have not completed your Edulastic assignment for ELA, it was posted yesterday. There was a reminder video. Make sure you take the time to sign on and work on it now. That's not going to be open but for a few days. Make sure you're signing on to Edulastic. Remember to complete that, you need to have access to your reader. So I tell you in the video as well, we're talking about the Navajo Codebreakers unit. It's a small chapter in our book. I want you to read that independently yourself and then complete the questions on Edulastic. The page numbers are on there. It starts on page 96. And then also, we yesterday, Thursday, we were passing out our packets as well. You should have already gotten your last big packet then for the remainder of the school year. If you have not, go ahead and reach out to an advisor today, talk to a teacher, let them know. That way we can figure out an extra time to have you come in and pick it up, or we can figure out a way to drop it off to you. But you need to make sure you're reaching out to someone. We're going to be collecting most of these at the end of the school year, and this is what we're going to help for your final trimester 3 grade. So the ball is in your hand. Make sure you're reaching out and asking for help if you haven't gotten anything yet. Our big question for Chapter 7, how did the arrival of settlers and the U.S. government's actions affect Native Americans living west of the Mississippi River? Today we're going to be talking about the middle part of the country, not quite the east, not quite the west, but the middle, where we got a lot of land from France during the Louisiana Purchase. We're going to be talking about that more in depth in our chapter. We're going to talk about how these settlers and the United States government affected Native Americans living west of the Mississippi and about the middle of our United States. So, like before, there's going to be a lot of impacts and effects you can talk about. That's going to be your race response towards the end. You're just going to have to mention one or two of these impacts or one of the ways it changed their life. Ties right into our I can statement for the day. I can explain the relationship between Native Americans, European settlers, and the United States government in a single paragraph outline. So you're going to talk about how these three groups are related and then how they interact with each other. What did Native Americans do to the settlers? What did the government do to Native Americans? What did the government offer settlers? How are these groups are connected and what they did for one another. Before we get started looking at our chapter, let's look at some of the vocab words we're going to see in it. First, we have lean. It's an adjective. It means having few resources, such as fuel, food, and money. So if someone's ever said to you, wow, you look really lean, or that's a lean-looking person, it usually means they're skinny, right? Like they're very narrow. Lean just means you have very few of something. So if I have a lean budget, it means I don't have a lot of money for important things. Lean, think of it as a Native American tribe might not have a lot of resources. Immigrant is a noun. They're people who leave their own country to live in another country. So like everyone in the world, everyone's an immigrant. Every group of people is an immigrant. Immigration is what has kept the world alive. It's how we trade with one another. It's how we share our cultures. It's a very important thing. Next we have prosper. It's a verb. Look at the ER ending. Prosper, prospering, prospered. To become rich and successful or to flourish. That just means to grow and become better. I want all of you guys to prosper in life. I want all of you to become successful. I know some of you want to become rich. I want all of you to prosper. Tracts is an area or strip of land. So a farm might have this tract of seeds or tracts of soil, these rows. Revenge, it's the act of doing something to hurt someone because they did something to hurt you. Revenge is a very difficult topic. We had a lit study book that was going to talk about revenge a lot. The revenge sounds very nice in the moment, but for the most part, revenge always leaves people feeling worse afterwards. Mark Twain had a really great quote about revenge, where he said, revenge is like an acid that you hold inside your body, and it's an acid you want to give someone else, but that acid is burning away and eating at and destroying you as well. It's not worth the damage you do to yourself just because you're holding on to all this revenge and hate for someone else. Revenge is a terrible cycle. A ward is someone who is under the care or control of the government. A ward could also be someone who's responsible for someone else. So a very famous example I would remember in the old Batman cartoons, they would say Robin is a ward of Batman because Batman's kind of like his foster father or like his adopted father. This is a boy that he takes care of for the government. A ward is just someone who's under the care of the government. So if you're someone who lives in an orphanage or you have foster parents, you may at one point have been a ward. It just means the government takes care of you. We have wards, people who immigrate into the country and they don't have anywhere to go yet. They might be a ward of the state. That state might help take care of them. And then I want you to practice your word work at the bottom. Try and finish these 2 sentences on your own that use our vocab words. It was a lean winter because. Why was it a lean winter? Why did they have so little? And then early cities in America started to prosper, but so early cities in America were prospering, they were growing and succeeding, but then what happened? Take a moment, finish those word work before we move on to our chapter. We're now going to start reading the introduction pages to Chapter 7, Severing Ties. It starts on page 58, 59, 60, 61. So those 4 pages before we move on to the first header. Make sure you have your reader open in a separate tab. It's in the video description below, and you can follow along. Starting at the top. Native Americans were well adapted to the cycle and patterns of nature. Whether they lived in a small fishing village or a large, sprawling farming society, they learned to survive in harmony with their surroundings. They used wood from trees, but they didn't cut down all the trees. They used every part of the buffalo, but they did not kill all the buffalo. They made jewelry from stones or shell beads and sometimes copper, but they did not destroy the mountains and rivers to get all these materials. They gathered nuts and berries, but not too many. They always left enough new seeds to sprout for future generations. The basic rules and patterns of nature never really change. The cycles remain the same, and yet change isn't everything. Change comes from every season, just as it comes in various stages of our life. These are the changes we understand and know to expect, but sometimes there are other types of changes. No one can predict exactly what the future will bring. Native Americans understand this fact long before they encountered Europeans. Native Americans always believed in the idea that we shouldn't use all of something because we have to preserve it for future generations. It's something that a lot of eco-friendly ideologies or beliefs push now is that, hey, we shouldn't destroy all these rivers or frack and drill into the ground for oil because we're destroying the land. And what about the future generations? What are we going to do to the planet? Native Americans always thought in the long term we shouldn't be hunting every animal too much because we want to make sure that they can reproduce and we have this food source for later generations. We should leave some seeds behind, some trees behind, enough that it can always grow, the cycle continue. Although the problem a lot of our society has now is that we're very reckless and that we like to get things quick and fast and we're not as worried about the damage that we cause. Starting on page 59. Though there are myths and spiritual ceremonies, Native Americans gave thanks and praise to nature's helping spirits, the plants, animals, water, and sunshine. They also asked the spirits for safety and mercy. They asked to be spared from famine, drought, and war. Most years, the people were happy, well-fed, and at peace with their neighbors. But they knew they would also be lean years when the buffalo herds were too thin or too little rain fell on the corn and bean crops. They knew there would be wars and conflict with other tribes as well. Some tribes controlled better land with more food and resources than other tribes. Some tribes grew to be large and dominant, while others simply survived from season to season. Some tribes faced more trials and tribulations than others. Sometimes one tribe would force another tribe off its land, and so on. For example, an eastern woodland tribe might have to adapt to life on the plains, or a plateau tribe might have to survive in the desert. Sometimes the victories of war would leave the losers captive, or adopt them into their tribe. Other times, mighty tribes fell and their weaker ones rose up. So these tribes would maybe start small, they'd get really big, they would come into contact with one another either through war or through trade. They would maybe like defeat one another and then the others would scatter, or they would join the tribe, that tribe would go and meet another tribe, and then the cycle would continue. Being in these tribes were very fluid, they changed. There was definitely ones that were around for hundreds of years, but they would always come into contact, and it was somewhat normal for tribes to be pushing each other off land, to be rearranging, and then have people moving between tribes based on wars. And so everything changed, and yet in many ways everything stayed the same. In spite of all of life's challenges, Native Americans upheld their way of life for thousands of years. Wherever they were, they strived to live in harmony with their surroundings. They lived according to the same patterns and cycles as everything else in nature. When the acorns ripened and fell, then it was time to gather and eat acorns. When the buffalo moved, it was time to move the village. And when the spring rains fell, it was time to plant new seeds. Year after year and generation after generation, according to these cycles, Native American tribes created their own history. So they also moved and followed nature. They followed these cycles. If these herds of animals are moving and that's our primary food source, we're going to move with them so that we can continue. Picking up at the top of page 60. Europeans who migrated to the Americas did not share the same tradition and beliefs as Native Americans. Aside from their culture, religion, and technology, Europeans had different beliefs regarding land ownership and individual rights and liberty. To understand just how very different they were, it's important to reflect on what life was like in Europe. So in Europe, the idea was you can buy land. This is my land. I paid for it. I own it. In America, or in the New World, Native Americans had no concept of owning land. It wasn't right to them for one person to own the land. That was a part of the earth. That was a part of a cycle that was much bigger than any of us. In the late 1400s, Europe was just emerging from the feudal system of the Middle Ages. Many people were still tied to farming the land, the bulk of which were owned by the rich, influential members of the nobility. There was no free land to settle on and explore. There was little social mobility. For 3,000 years after Columbus's first journey, the exploration and colonization of the New World brought incredible wealth to European nations. However, a large part of that wealth went straight to the same royals and aristocrats who already owned all the land and resources in the Old World. So, Europe is also a pretty small country. There was no new land for people to go out and buy for themselves. If you wanted that land, you would have to work your way up and then maybe purchase it for yourself. But like they say, there's no social mobility. That means if you start as a poor peasant, you're not going to become a nobleman. You're not going to become a ruler like a duke. That's not going to happen for you. The whole point of this system is that when you're born, you're locked in that place. And that's how the people who are more powerful than you like it. They want people like that to be stuck down there because it means their power is never threatened. Starting on page 61. Then came the founding of the United States in 1776. This new nation put in place systems of laws designed to protect the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the New World offered new hope and opportunity for even the most lowly members of the European society. The New World offered land ready to be farmed to all, including all those who had never had an opportunity in their own countries. However, it's not all that simple. By the late 1700s, land in the Far East had been claimed, and there was stiff competition for jobs. Therefore, many new immigrants looked around beyond the East to the frontier, the untamed wilderness, for opportunities. So, people arrived in the New World to America. They settled in the East, Christopher Columbus, our 13 colonies. After a while, all that land starts getting divvied up. People have all figured that out. We need to start looking to the frontier, to this new land, and see if there's anything out there for us. Because right now, there's no fresh opportunities. Next up, we're looking at the header, The Nation Doubles in Size. It's the bulk of our chapter. It's on page 62. And it's going to be going from 62 to 67. If you look at the picture beneath me here, that's the swath or cut of land that we actually bought from France in the Louisiana Purchase. So we got the majority of states like Montana, Wyoming, we got half of Colorado, we got all of South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, and just only a little bit of Louisiana. This was mostly land that the French, who had gotten to the middle of the country first, had started to develop. They had started to grow, and that they had somehow claimed for themselves just by the right of being there first. Land ownership is weird. Apparently, if you're there first, it's just yours if you put a stake in the ground. But we bought it from them. We'll talk about that in a moment, though. Starting at the top of page 62. In 1803, President Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the nation's territory. This huge area of land was mostly unmapped and unknown wilderness to Europeans settling in the United States. In 1804, Lewis and Clark began their famous journey to explore the land west of the Mississippi River. Their exploration helped spark interest in this land, and by 1850, people realized that all the land was not only vast but full of resources. It did not take long for the news to travel to Europe. For those escaping the troubles of the Old World, the American West seemed like a haven. Imagine that you live in Europe, you're a peasant, you're someone low, you owe a lot of money. There's this whole part in America, in this new country that's just open and free. You can go there, take whatever you need, no one's claimed it yet. There, anyone could live free and prosper if they were willing to work. Also, it turned out, they'd need to be willing to fight or manage the Native Americans who had been living there for thousands of years. So, just because the French sold this land to America, that now meant the Native Americans who had been there for thousands of years before had to leave, because somehow the French had priority over them. It was not right. Throughout the second half of the 1800s, immigrants, largely from Europe, flowed into the United States. Many became pioneers, risking everything for a chance to settle and build new lives. Generally, pioneers were not there to live in harmony or with nature or abide by Native Americans' laws or customs. They were there to tame the land and gain wealth from it. No one was coming out here to meet and to negotiate with the Native Americans. It was just to take and gain wealth. On page 63, some of the resources were obvious. There was endless forest, fine soil, ranch land, massive buffalo herds, and sometimes even gold nuggets just sitting on the ground waiting to be picked up. But most of the valuable resources were buried underground, such as coal, iron, oil, copper, and other minerals. These resources did not shine like gold or silver, but over time, they provided even more value. They provided the raw materials for America's growing cities and industries. For the people of the United States, the America West was a giant treasure trove of land and resources. However, Native Americans had already made this land their home. Like, it sounds great. There's gold laying on the ground. There's a lot of areas you can mine, but this isn't your land. This doesn't belong to anyone. These people lived here first. Flipping the page to 64 at the top. To the pioneers of the U.S. government who wanted to settle on this land, the presence of Native Americans was a problem. The U.S. government decided that one way to control and confront Native Americans was to encourage immigrants and other people in crowded eastern cities to move west. This gave rise to one of the most important acts of legislation or important laws in U.S. history, the Homestead Act of 1862. Within the passage of the Homestead Act, vast tracts of land throughout the West were made available to new settlers. Anyone aged 21 or older could apply for a homestead of usually 160 acres. That is a lot of land. In exchange, all they had to do was live on it for at least 5 years and improve it by creating a ranch or a farm. The Homestead Act triggered a land rush throughout the American West as thousands of new settlers staked their claim and worked to build new lives. So imagine they said, yeah, you can go out to the West, you can get 160 acres for free, all to yourself. All you gotta do is build something there and live on it. Because this was their way of starting to push out the Native Americans by giving out all this land for free. Page 65. Of course, many of these homesteads were on Native American homelands. Many tribes felt they had no choice but to defend their way of life. Problems started in small disagreements, but soon spiraled out of control. The brutal Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 is an example of this. In that case, U.S. soldiers in Colorado attacked a peaceful village and killed over 100 Cheyenne, mostly women, children, and elderly men. The tribe's warriors were out hunting at the time, but then when they returned and saw what the soldiers had done, they swore revenge. The surviving Cheyenne and other tribes attacked settlers throughout the area, kidnapping and killing entire families. Thus began a bloody cycle of revenge. So like we talked about earlier with revenge, it just made everything worse for everyone involved. This massacre was terrible. U.S. soldiers had no right to be there and attack women and children and elderly. Like, these were people that had no threat to them whatsoever. And then the surviving Cheyenne, when you come back and you find this happening to your family members, they would go out and then they would want revenge as well. And then when the Cheyenne got their revenge, U.S. citizens and soldiers would want revenge for whatever they did, and then on and on. It didn't make anyone happy. It only made everything worse. Wars between Native Americans and settlers from the United States broke out in every region of the West, and from the Great Plains to California. These wars were bloody and costly. In an effort to end the fighting and solve the Indian problem once and for all, the U.S. government greatly expanded the reservation system. This meant forcing Native Americans into areas of land set aside for them. This had begun earlier with the Indian Appropriation Act of 1851. I'm not expecting you to remember all the years. I'm just expecting you to remember what each of these laws or acts did. So, the Homestead Act gave free land to anyone who wanted it. The Indian Appropriation Act is when the Congress set aside money to create reservations throughout what is now Oklahoma. Many tribes refused to move to the reservations at first, so the U.S. Army tried to force them. The fighting only increased and the wars became bloodier. So imagine that these soldiers are coming up to your tribe and saying, yeah, you have to move now. Our government passed a law, even though we've only been here for a couple, your tribes have been here for thousands of years. We arrive and we say, you got to go live in these small camps now. We want all this land for ourselves. Picking up on page 66 at the top. After years of war, some tribes managed to make peace treaties with the U.S. government. Instead of moving to distant reservations, individual tribes were allowed to carve out little land reservations in their ancestral homelands. This was the case with some of the stronger, larger tribes. They still lost much of their land and freedom, but each tribe was treated as an independent nation within the United States. So each of these little tribes were like an independent nation of their own and apparently could talk to the government. Unfortunately, none of these treaties lasted long. Settlers continued to encroach on Native American land anyway. Encroach means to sneak up upon and to take. So if you're encroaching on someone, you're like sneaking, you're slowly taking more and more. These settlers would come up and they would try and take more and more land over time, even if it wasn't theirs. Furthermore, the reservation lands were usually unsuited to support the tribes. So this probably wasn't good land for these groups of people to be forced to live on in the first place. Due to little rain and poor soil, they often left the reservation to hunt and gather food. If you don't have any of that, it's natural, yeah, you're going to go off the reservation. They try and get some for your own. The main problem, as far as the settlers and the government were concerned, was that some of the tribes still had powerful, popular leaders. Even on reservations, Native Americans maintained power and influence because they continued to work together as tribes. The U.S. government felt that the tension and fighting would continue as long as Native American tribes were treated as independent nations within a nation. So, the U.S. government was scared that there's a bunch of these really powerful, popular people in these tribes that are keeping them all working together. There's still some people in these tribes that are saying, hey, we can't let them divide us. We all have to work together now more than ever. That scared the United States government because that meant that the tribes had more power. They wanted them to be weak so they could continue to take advantage of them. Picking up on the third paragraph, with the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the United States officially stopped treating each tribe as a separate nation. After 1871, all individual Native Americans were considered wards of the United States government. So that basically means you belong to the state. The government takes care of you. The U.S. government no longer wished to deal with tribes as a whole. Instead, they wanted to deal with individuals in the hope that the tribe structure would finally collapse once and for all. Native Americans were no longer independent, but they were not U.S. citizens. In fact, in the eyes of the law, they became dependents with few freedoms and rights to do everything unless the government agreed. So think of just like any other group of people throughout our history, women, Native Americans, African Americans. We just say, hey, you are not a white European man. You don't get as many rights as anyone else. Even these Native Americans, you're not allowed to be a tribe anymore, but you're still not allowed to be a citizen. You have less rights than everyone else because we've decided that. Of course, one act of Congress did not change structure that had been in place for thousands of years. Just because the government says, hey, your tribes are gone, doesn't mean people are going to stop. While some Native Americans decided the best way to survive was to lay down their guns and learn to live according to the laws of the United States, many others refused to give up. To them, life on the reservation was no life at all, and they would rather die fighting than watch their families starve. But eventually the U.S. government did succeed in breaking down the tribes. Although the Appropriation Act of 1871 did not bring an end to the war, it marked the beginning of a tragic chapter, and the story of Native American resistance. So, even though we've broken down their tribes, they haven't officially decided and stopped with a tribal structure, and that makes the government upset. There's still some resistance going on, despite these groups being forced on reservations. If you look on 67 on the right, there's a small quote I want to read. Broken promises. Years later, a great Lakota chief named Red Cloud said this: "They made us many promises, more than I can remember, but they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it." This quote neatly summarizes what happened to Native Americans when the United States expanded across the West. Tribes had a connection to the land that non-Native Americans could not understand. Without land, it was extremely difficult for tribes to maintain their culture and identity. Being forced off these ancient lands and being forced into these new places was completely foreign to them. They felt like new people. This is like ripping when you're like ripped out of your home or somewhere you're really comfortable. They felt like they lost a part of themselves and their soul when they're forced to leave everything behind. Picking up in your notes, we have three headers. We have one header, the nation doubles in size, but we have three categories we're going to be filling in. We have Native Americans, settlers, and government. We're going to be talking about how these groups interacted with one another and what they did in this chapter. Because remember, our I can statement is we can talk about the relationships between these different groups. For the first one, we have Native Americans. Native Americans already made land their home. All this land was already theirs. They had no other option than to either defend their homes by force or surrender. In 1864, we had the Sand Creek Massacre that killed 100 Cheyenne, including women and children, because this shows you they had no choice but to fight and defend this home. But the impact and look at the loss of life their tribes felt, and even think of how our government mistreated and what kind of crime this was to attack women and children. And lastly, they were eventually made wards of the federal government, not independent, but not U.S. citizens. So they get to be half citizens. They don't get the same rights as everyone else despite what they've gone through. Take a moment to pause the video, fill in these guided notes. The settlers came to this territory with the promise of new land. This is why they were coming west in the first place. Anyone 21 and up could get 160 acres of land for free. And they saw Native Americans as a problem. Remember, it said the settlers would continue to encroach or take land away from them. They didn't see these as people they could meet and befriend as neighbors. They thought as them as the enemy and someone that was stopping them from getting more wealth and more land. Take a moment to pause the video here. Finish filling out your guided notes on settlers. Lastly, we have the U.S. government. I mostly mentioned some of the acts, the specific actions that they did or legislations they passed that impacted the settlers and the Native Americans. So, for example, think of 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. It bought land middle of the country from France. It effectively doubled how big our country was too at that time. 1863 or 1862, the Homestead Act. There was free new land offered to those who would improve it and farm on it. This would mostly be the settlers. And then I didn't use the Reservation Act for the last one. I just talked generally and said attempted treaties with Native Americans would eventually force them into reservations at the cost of many lives. So it doesn't matter that they made these treaties or they passed these legislations. Most of the time they'd go back on their word or they'd be unhappy about something. So they even said your tribes can be independent nations within our country, but they viewed that as the threat after a while and they decided to take away that right. Take a moment to pause the video here. Finish your guided notes on the U.S. government. Lastly, we have a race response or a single paragraph outline. This is going to be really easy, especially with our notes after our reader. How did the arrival of settlers and the actions of the U.S. government affect natives living west of the Mississippi? So, how did the settlers and the government affect Native Americans? We just listed off 100 different things they did to these groups of people in these tribes. I start you out with some sentence starters. Once you have completed all these sentence starters, I want you to flip the page and then write it as a complete paragraph. So we start out with our topic. The arrival of settlers and the actions of the U.S. government affected natives living west of the Mississippi by what did they do generally? You may even just say by taking their land and attacking them, Supporting detail 1, give me a specific thing settlers did. You can talk about the encroaching they did. You can talk about the Homestead Act. And then the supporting detail 2, what did the government impact? How did the government impact Native Americans? So look back at some of the acts or legislations and laws passed and see what the U.S. government did that impacted the Native Americans. Make sure when you're done, you rewrite it as a complete paragraph. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a text or a phone call. I'll do my best to help you out. Make sure that you also have figured out a way, or you've already gotten your new packet to start on Monday. If not, reach out to your advisor and we can figure out some way of getting that to you, but you're going to need it first thing on Monday. I hope you scholars have a great weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see you Monday. Bye-bye.